Welcome to the next episode of the Entrepreneurial Excellence podcast. It is with great pleasure and frankly just excitement to have an old friend of mine, Alexi Robichaux, with me today, who is the CEO and co-founder of BetterUp. I have had the pleasure of knowing Alexi for, 14 years maybe at this point. And we've, over the years, of course, we've moved, had families, done all the things, and haven't had as many chances to catch up. So in some ways, this is an opportunity not only for me to catch up with you, which is exciting, but also learn from you. I mean, we were in a very similar place many, many years ago, and I was lucky enough to be, full disclosure, an early investor in BetterUp, and now look at BetterUp today, and being able to see you and watch you from afar, learn and grow as a founder, leader, and builder has been, frankly, a pleasure. So thank you for that, Alexi, but also thank you for being here today.
Well, it's so kind of you, Adam. Thank you. I mean, it's all on the backs of people like you who believed in Eddie and myself and a pretty wild idea. We rewind the clock to 11 years ago. So thanks for having that conviction and confidence. And thanks for all the coaching and mentorship along the way.
Well, the great thing about BetterUp 11 years ago, when it was just an idea, and even today, is it just made a lot of sense, right? The whole thesis where it was like, and this is the best ideas, frankly, that I've invested in, had the luxury and privilege of investing in. When you say, hey, look, why do we have something that's called quote unquote executive coaching? And it's valuable for executives and companies who are willing to spend thousands and thousands of dollars on it, but not have coaching for everyone else in your team. It was like, oh yeah, that's sort of completely obvious, but it wasn't back then. And now you made it a reality. But so one of the questions I like to kick off with and really start with is, the podcast called Entrepreneurial Excellence. How would you define excellence as an entrepreneur, either with yourself or all the people you've had the pleasure of working with and you work with, and I'm sure know lots of other really excellent entrepreneurs? What does that mean or look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I of course, there's components of general leadership in there, but I think what's unique to the strand of leadership that you're trying to speak to when we use the term entrepreneur, I think in many ways is this ability to go, out of nothing. Ex nihilo would be called in like literature. Out of nothing, you bring forth something, 0 to 1, and Peter Thiel speak, whatever you want to call it. I think it's this idea to envision a future and then to do whatever the heck it takes to make that happen. And, that is to be enterprising, right? If we're being enterprising, that is what we are doing. And I think entrepreneurship at its core really isolates in leadership the trait of having a bold vision, having some sort of dream, and a dream that doesn't previously exist, typically a dream that starts with 0, with nothing, and then having the combination of resolve, grit, skills, whatever it may take. It's often a messy and not a very elegant process, but I think the result of it is you bring forth something into the world that wasn't there before. And what's excellence is a function of that. I mean, just doing that is excellence. Like, it's so, as you know, better than most. Like, there are better entrepreneurs and worse entrepreneurs, but if you're any sort of entrepreneurs, I take my hat off to you, because it's really hard. And it is a very particular subset of, I think, leadership that a lot of other contexts don't require as much of.
Yes, it is definitely incredibly difficult, and anyone who tries it is worth celebrating. With that said, though, are there certain elements around sort of like that a willingness to just get out there and go do it? Like, there's lots and lots of entrepreneurs out there, not just in the tech space that we're in, but SMBs, you name it. Everyone can be an entrepreneur, yet many, 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 the large majority, frankly, fail. So are there certain elements that you think set them apart? Like, don't be shy, brag about yourself. Like, what set you apart? Was it what enabled you to get BetterUp to where you are today? And actually, maybe before you answer that question, can you give everyone like kind of a high level overview of kind of where BetterUp today is, like number of teammates, however other metrics that you're publicly open to sharing?
Yeah, I mean, we're in the hundreds of millions of ARR. We're a pre-public company. We mainly do large enterprises, so we have about 700 companies around the world. We're in 90 countries. I think we are 30 plus languages in terms of the support and services we provide. And we're about 600 employees and thousands of coaches across 11 different coaching verticals or expertise at this point. So we get all the blessings and curses of being scaled.
Mhm.
And obviously we still, from my perspective, still early in our journey. We have a lot of ways to go, but we've been through a lot of ups and downs, to your point there. To your original question, if we're talking through excellence, I mean, there's a lot that probably makes an excellent entrepreneur, a lot that make more excellent entrepreneurs than I'll ever be. I think one thing though is point of view. I think like when you're talking about the best entrepreneurs and having the benefit to meet some of them by being in the valley, to study them, to learn from them, they have a different view of the future or where the world is headed than the average bear. And I think so much of what they do comes and emanates from that unique point of view. And in a way, they're working backwards from that future. They don't always fully see that's the vision of the company, is to build that. But they do have a different operating paradigm or hypothesis about where the world is going to go. And I think that is where a lot of the what looks bold and like crazy bets, well, they don't actually, to the entrepreneur, they don't always feel crazy. They actually just kind of feel inevitable sometimes, because you have this worldview and you're like, well, this is going to happen. And then it kind of becomes, am I going to make it happen, or is someone else going to make it happen? Because at least even if it's the wrong worldview, it's a clear worldview to you that the world is going to move in this sort of direction. So if we use someone like Elon Musk, just because he's so talked about, we all know about him, I know clearly a very successful entrepreneur. Like, yeah, he has a worldview that humanity is going to become an interplanetary species. That's not like if you went and, did a poll of every human on Earth, I don't think most people share that worldview. Well, he does. And so if you're operating in that worldview, it's like, well, this is going to happen, or it should happen. So I'm going to make it happen. And that worldview informs how he does everything and how he builds his business. And he's building backwards in view of that worldview. And you can go, from Zuckerberg to Andre Steve Jobs, like at their core, there's a lot of stuff, traits, leadership, all this stuff. But I actually think this point of view is really important. And then when you're creating category defining products, like you have to have a unique point of view. You have to have a point of view that creates a whole new consciousness in a market or a consumer base on how they should purchase goods and services. So that unique point of view about where the world is going, I find that it's one of the biggest hallmarks of really driven and successful entrepreneurs.
So totally agree. But even then, digging in like further, right? So I see hundreds of pitches every year, and you probably see plenty even as well from people who have a unique perspective, right? They're like, I'm on this journey, I'm building a company, I'm going to go make it a thing. Yet 90% of them flame out and don't go anywhere.
Sure.
So in using yourself or Elon Musk or others, like what is a different level that enables them to make that specific view a reality?
I mean, there's probably a ton of skills in there. I think we can unpack, and happy to. I mean, I think one, and it may be obvious to folks like you and myself who are in it all day, I don't think there can be enough said for not giving up. Like most people flame out because they quit. Like it's that simple. I mean, you don't have to quit. Like you can go bankrupt. You can still work on your idea when you're bankrupt. It's not like we don't have debtor's prison anymore as a society. So like there's really nothing stopping you but you at some level. You either consciously choose to continue or not continue. And people make a risk reward judgment. But people often ask like, oh, how are you and Eddie still doing this after 11 years? And my answer is really easy. We didn't stop. Like, that's the literal answer. And if I think of entrepreneurs of the same cohort or vintage you were getting pitched by them at the time, I bet there's like under 1% who are still working on their ideas.
Oh, yeah.
And and that's of any, if you take any decade vintage, you're going to find that. That's not like something special. It is special, I think, to be in that 1%. You have to have some, probably it helps to have some commercial success to do that. But I actually think there's a lot of moments where we should have quit in retrospect. Like if you were doing a rational, weight adjusted risk reward equation at the time, I'm obviously glad we didn't, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. We wouldn't be here. But there's something for that grit and that doggedness and just that refusal. For me, it goes back to that worldview, though, because you believe that worldview is bigger than you and it's an inevitability, or it's something you want to will into the world so much that keeps you going, I think, where it may not keep others going.
Is there a point where do you think people need to ever change? Like either they quit or they pivot or do something different? Or would you say, you know what, if you have just a great idea and it's one you really believe, you will find a way to make that a reality? Or is it, or even for BetterUp to some extent, right? You had a very clear original vision that frankly, most VCs and investors did not buy into. And has that changed over time for you guys? Or in a sense, it hasn't wavered? and you're still on that same journey 11 years later?
I think it's the vision hasn't wavered. I think we're still in the messy middle, right? Like getting there has been more circuitous than we thought. That's always, I think, the case. But the grandiose vision, where we ultimately want to go, has been the same, to your point. That actually hasn't changed at all. It's kind of remarkable. The path to get there, I don't think we ever would have envisioned at the time. But that North Star still animates our efforts and still guides us. I'm trying to think on that. Yeah. And so, should someone quit? I think that's a personal decision. I mean, risk to reward is very personal. Maybe they need to. I mean, maybe they have a family circumstance. Maybe they just say the opportunity cost of my time at some point. I am wrong about this. Maybe the opportunity is not as big as I thought. I think you need a really clear worldview, but that doesn't mean the worldview is right. And so you may, I think it is entirely intellectually possible and honest as you progress to say, well, maybe I was just wrong. Like actually, like I thought the world was going A and I wanted to help build that. And actually I'm learning along the way that it's not A, it's B. And maybe I want to go do B now, or I think it's A and I'm going to keep at A. And yes, the waves are crashing against me. There's a ton of headwinds, but I stay undeterred. So that is the hardest question I always get. Like, when would you know to quit? And part of it is because I may be really bad at it. I haven't quit. So
You don't know. You
like
don't have quit in
I
the
don't know. Maybe I should have quit. I don't know. So I could be like the worst person to ask because maybe, a better entrepreneur would have already quit this and been on to a much even bigger opportunity. I have no idea. But for me, Ellie and I never felt that. We've never had a conversation about stopping or quitting. And I think why is because we always, even when things seem very bleak or dark, or we always saw the next door to go through, the next wicket, I would always say, like in croquet, it's like we always saw it, even how small the wicket was, like, okay, well, there's one more thing we can try. And every time when we would try, we never ran out of another way to move forward. And it's like a sailboat, like it's not straightforward. It's like you're tacking, but we always found a vector of attack. I mean, at least up till today, call me tomorrow, maybe we'll be like, yeah, no more vectors. I don't feel that way right now, but that's why in practice, we've never quit. We felt like it's really meaningful work. It's the opportunity of a lifetime. And no matter how pressed we've been, squeezed, dejected, rejected, whatever negative feelings we've had, and we've had them all. I think when we wake up the next morning, we've always been like, we got one more left in the chamber. Worst case, sometimes we have a lot in the chamber. Let's go try this. And I guess we've been either lucky enough or risk managed well enough that it's paid off. We got no other options, nothing else we can figure out.
I do think though, and maybe it's a good way to sort of, speaking of tacking, going back to the early days of BetterUp, but even maybe further back in your career, where part of it, from what I've seen with a lot of people, is you it's not luck per se. You kind of make your own luck, right? So the ability to be an entrepreneur, to have a little bit of headroom to take those risks, is because you're putting yourself out there, because you're willing to work a little bit harder than others, and put yourself in a situation and scenario that you can take these risks and have unique insight and meet great people and push yourself against them. So walking back to like the early days, even of your career, like what did you always want to be an entrepreneur? Or, I mean, I know you didn't start off as an entrepreneur, what pushed you in this path and direction in the first place?
I think the way I would say it in retrospect is I actually was always an entrepreneur, although I thought I needed a real job. I thought I would be, I mean, you went to law. I thought I'd be a constitutional lawyer. So very different. You went to law school, right?
I did. Yep. Good memory. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I was always an entrepreneur, and like at least until, maybe not when I was like, well, actually, yeah, I was the kid selling lemonade proverbially. So I was always hustling. But, my little brother and I taught ourselves programming when I was in junior high. He was in elementary school. I mean, back then it was like, Cold Fusion, PHP, and ASP, and Flash was like Flash 3 or 4 at the time. And we did web design for my dad's friends and their businesses. And so, like, I think I always had the drive. I didn't think of that way. And then I got into social entrepreneurship and doing nonprofit work. And that was always what animated me, always what made me excited and energized. But I didn't really know any entrepreneurs in that way. And so I just kind of grew up thinking, okay, that's like what I'm doing because I'm a kid. I'm going to have to get a real job eventually, go to school, go to grad school, and like life will ensue. And in my course of life, I think entrepreneurship was kind of like the call to adventure that wouldn't go away. And so I fell back into it. I started my career formally at the Walt Disney Company, kind of the antithesis of entrepreneurship, but learned a ton and realized that didn't make me happy. And I was having more energy from this nonprofit. It was more entrepreneurship. And I thought maybe I'll go closer to entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley to tech and blah, blah, blah. I ended up at a startup and that was the closest taste of it. And then it kind of clicked like, hey, this is kind of the same thing I've been doing in the social sector. This is just like for-profit entrepreneurship. And actually calls back and harkens back to my love of building cool stuff and how cheap you can do that in the web world and programming. And so that's how I found my way. Very non-strategic, not planned out by any measure or means. But to answer the question, I think the drive was always there. I actually think I had to kind of like unlearn a bunch of stuff that I thought I had to do to be an adult, and actually realize, oh, you can have a job, quotes, or you can have a career, quotes, because they're not really that, doing this techie entrepreneur stuff, building websites essentially at its core full time. There's a whole world of that. And that was so new for me coming from Disney and visiting friends in Silicon Valley. It's like, there's this whole wild world where like people give 20 something people who can program millions of dollars to do crazy ideas. Like that's incredible.
Yeah.
I want to be part of that.
It's still, by the way, insane. I mean, I think it's one of the craziest feelings in the world where you raise money and next thing you know, you've never seen more than probably, low, maybe six figures or something in your bank account, or if you're lucky, things like that, or maybe probably less than that, 5 figures. And next thing you know, you have a business bank account with your startup and there's 7 figures, there's millions of dollars in it. And you're like, no one's looking over my shoulder about what I can do with this. It's just like, you like, go ahead. And it's almost a social contract because you could just turn around and pay yourself a massive salary and
that's right.
Or take your whole team on a retreat to like Hawaii and do what you want to do. And yet it's shocking actually how often that doesn't happen. But I think it's because people are really driven to make something of themselves when they have that opportunity.
And I mean, I think for writer, look, I think, the last couple of years have been a little wacky, but venture consistently historically drives returns. I mean, it works as a system. It works because there clearly are prudent decisions being made along the way. There's probably some newsworthy bad decisions, but as a class, like it exists because it returns earnings to shareholders, which means it works, right? And so you're right, the system works. It creates the greatest innovation of our time consistently. Like if you think of the, 20 years greatest companies, almost all of them are tech at their core that have been birthed, right? Not legacy companies. And it takes a particular, I think, drive and motivation to want to do that. And it takes a capital structure, to your point, that's pretty laissez-faire, all things considered, and being able to allow people the latitude and the freedom to do that and view that as a feature, not a bug. That like the more latitude we give, the better ideas we get. That's really rare. Like I started in finance in my career. Like that's not how most people manage their capital. They manage it the exact opposite of that. Oh, yeah. So I love to beat up on VCs. You love to, we all do as entrepreneurs, but like you got to have a lot of respect for them. They're making very high stakes bets with very poor information typically. And on average, they're more, they're not more right than wrong, but dollar wise, they're more right than wrong in terms of they still get returns.
Yeah, exactly right. And so there's two diverging paths. I'm trying to decide which one to go down, but let's keep.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. Let's keep on the. I want to come back to sort of the dollar returns and stuff like that because I do think that's a component of what it means to be excellent in depending on how you define it. But let's first stick on like the drive for you, as in so early days you go to a startup. The startup gets acquired by VMware. You go to VMware, and then after VMware, you decide I'm going to go start a company. Is that when? You don't talk about it a lot publicly. Is that when you decided you wanted to go into YC and start your own company? And what made you decide, I want to go down that path? You have a good job as a product lead, I think, at VMware. That's a great company, probably making good money. Yeah. Why take the risk and go do Y Combinator?
Yeah, so that, it was a risk. I think it was, like obviously we were part of an acquisition. I'd have to go add it back up, but I'm sure it was $1 million plus of comp I forewent, which,
that's a huge risk. I mean, for most people, that's like,
2013.
Right there.
Yeah. I mean, that's money anytime, but in 2013, that was more than it is today.
And you were also younger. That was like a massive payday for someone who probably was
listening. Yeah, for sure. I was 25 or 26. I think I was the youngest executive of the company, like one of them, at least, if not the youngest. So yes, it was, that actually wasn't, I had already like, that wasn't the first time I had to make that decision, although the stakes were higher. I think leaving Disney was actually in some ways the bigger decision
Really?
because that was a prestigious company to work for, a big job. And I was going to an unknown startup and it ended up working out really well. Yay. But that felt like a bigger jump because it was like, hey, it's a whole different path now. Like you're not trying to climb up the career ladder. You're going to some unknown thing that feels like a moonshot. Maybe it will succeed. I think VMware, there's more on the table to stay, right? And they were motivated to try to keep me. But I think it's like I already kind of like broken that wall down and realized I feel most energized and I feel happiest when I am making the bet. And look, there's a side of this is like I was in a great position and a fortunate position that I could afford to make the bet. And not everyone can. And we need to fix that. But for me, I was single. I didn't have a lot of debt. I left school a year early, so I wouldn't have a lot of debt. And in retrospect, I don't think I give myself and my former self enough credit that like I actually kind of primed the pump where it was easier for me to take the leap than it otherwise could have been for maybe someone else, or had I not made these decisions. And so for me, it was like, what do I have to lose? I remember telling myself, okay, worst case, I move home to Dallas with my parents, which will be, I mean, they're awesome. I'd love to, but like, it'll be a little embarrassing because like you went from being in Silicon Valley at a tech company where you're a young exec, but like, it won't kill me. And, you know, I'll probably rally from that. And that's a privilege to have that as your safety net. But it took that kind of thinking. You're like, why am I scared of doing this? Because I was scared of doing it. And it was like, what do I really have to lose here? And so, yeah, I was like, let's go try this. Let's bet on myself. I've seen this talented entrepreneur. I've been close to him. I've worked really hand in hand with him. And I don't know that I'll be that good, but I feel like I have what it takes. And I want to give myself a shot there.
What do you think, before we talk a little bit more about YC and some of these first companies, just going back to you as an individual, like, so people, the question is really, if people are kind of comparing themselves, like Alexi, very successful entrepreneur, what are those different levels that put you in the position you think as an individual at Disney and then at VMware to be a really senior executive, a 25-year-old senior executive at VMware? Like, what is it about yourself? Do you think you work harder? I mean, I'm sure you wouldn't say you're smarter necessarily, but like, what is a different level that certainly served you well then, and obviously served you well today with BetterUp, right? What is that differentiating piece when you think about all of your peers who were the same age or even similar executives at that time? You had something different and still do, probably. Like, how would you define that?
I mean, I think the technical definition would be a compromised risk reward center in the brain. So I think it's just a cognitive,
basically in your brain.
yeah, I'm more broken, man. I was also, you know, before I programmed, last I programmed, I mean, I used to build half pipes with my buddies and we were into all sorts of extreme sports. So there's probably an adrenaline junkie side to it. And maybe that's not maybe that is a comment. I've never thought of it. Like, were there a lot of skateboarders and rollerbladers who also programmed? That's probably, in retrospect, that may be a small Venn diagram.
Yep.
At the time in the mid 90s. But that was me. And that was my little brother as well. And so I think there's some thrill seeking, probably, if I'm kind of self analyzing. I think it's hard to compare yourself to others. I think the grit, a high pain tolerance is part of it. If I were to look across peers, I think high pain tolerance of it. I think I was fortunate at an early age through my nonprofit work to learn a very important lesson in life, secret, whatever you want to call it, which is most of success is social. And that, like, at least any success I've had, and I haven't had a lot, but I think for most people, there's probably the Mozarts out there who just kind of like are thrust upon the world as these singularities. But most of it is a function of who you surround yourself with, the social systems of support you have. Smarter friends make you smarter, things like that. And I was very fortunate to learn that through philanthropy and nonprofit work, because the mayor, the city council members, they would take us under their wings, and we got like really cool tutelage and mentorship at a very young age in our 16, 17-year-old years. And that I always continued. And so I think when I did take on things that for me were daunting challenges at the time, I probably had higher pain tolerance, and I probably had a little more self-belief, not as a function of myself, but because I had this chorus of angels and literally things like angel investors who were like, you can do this. And I think without that, I don't know that I would have. I mean, it's not rational to do it. And I don't know that I would have hung in there as long. And so I actually think that ecosystem of care and support it buffers quite a lot, and it allows you to withstand more than you would stand by yourself, I think.
I will say though, I mean, part of you being very nice about this, but part of what gave me the confidence to say I want to invest in, because I have lots of friends who I could have invested in
Sure.
and I didn't. You have, and I'm guessing a lot of your colleagues and peers and people who put you in these senior positions saw this about you, is there's sort of this drive behind your eyes where I'm like, Alexi's going to work so hard to make this a success. Like he's unwilling to fail. I can't really explain it. It's just sort of this clear drive that I think you just have, which you don't see with a lot of entrepreneurs always. They're sort of,
Interesting.
they don't always have that. And it seems like you must have had that, not just with the early investors who invest in BetterUp and obviously the later ones, but at these early positions you had, where like, we're going to put Alexi as a 25-year-old senior executive at VMware who we're going to pay 7 figures to. Like, there's clearly something you're exuding to say, we trust this person to get it done and get it done well, and frankly, better than the alternative people we could put in that position.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I guess in my internal narrative about myself, I am obsessive, but that may express itself as drive externally. But yeah, so we love Abraham Maslow at BetterUp. I think the nice way to describe the positive, virtuous way, not nice for me, the virtuous way to describe what you're saying, he would call B values and B power, which are some people are fundamentally motivated by constructing beauty in the world. And that's kind of like the maker culture, right? It's like, I want to make great things. Some people are fundamentally motivated, he says, by D power, which is dominance and like just dominating others. And his argument, and is really creative people, it's B power, because it's the only sustainable power. And it's like an honest power that brings beauty and things in the world. And the example he uses is not super like glorious. So the example he uses of B power is, he talks about a guy who orders a steak at a restaurant and they mess up his steak. And he's like, the B power person sends the steak back infinite times until it's right.
Yep.
Why? Because the steak should be cooked well in principle. And so I'm not maybe to that level, but yes, I will, I actually probably most of the time, I'm like, this is too socially awkward to send the steak back 8 times in a restaurant. But at work, to your point, I send the steak back infinite times. I do know that about myself, to the annoyance of most people around me. Not because I think I'm smarter or I think I'm better, but because I think a steak should be better, right? And so maybe that's where the drive comes from. I guess my own self story is often that's more of maybe a flaw or character defect or an obsession in me than something virtuous. But as you say that, I'm like, oh, maybe I need a little more self-compassion. And there's a Maslowian tilt to this around trying to construct beauty in the world.
But actually, I think in the Maslow version, or even better, in some ways, obsession is sort of a more clear descriptor. Like, I actually really like the idea of probably a lot of the best entrepreneurs have that obsessive streak where they're like, I'm going to go deeper on this topic, right? Even today, right? You're managing 600 people at BetterUp today. You probably know more about some of these topics than some of your project managers sometimes, to their own embarrassment or their own frustration.
Totally.
And it's because
not all the time, but yes,
you will spend more time reading and going deeper on these topics than they will, because you are obsessed with it.
I think that's right. And I think that's true in any of these, whether you're talking about Zuckerberg, any of these kind of iconic, Elon Musk famously, right? Like, I think that's right. Walt Disney's a big inspiration of mine. Like, totally. That guy could out animate. I mean, he literally drew Mickey Mouse. Most successful animation of all time.
How does that then go into creating a culture that works with that, right? Because a level of obsession can probably be really strangling for a culture if that obsessive individual is not also really good. Like, so said differently, sort of my assumption, and please correct me if this is wrong, is creating that obsessive culture does create or enable amazing outcomes, building products that are truly world changing. At the same time, it probably pisses a lot of people off. And you probably have a lot of people who are like, I don't want to be a part of this. But you also have people who are like, that is the only place I want to work. I want to go work with people who are pushing to be the very best in the world. How did you build that at BetterUp? What does that look like? How do you deal with that cultural elements that, frankly, it's an outgrowth of you, right? But it's also building a great company.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the honest answer is I'm still messing this up every day. I think we're generally getting better. And I actually think those have been, in retrospect, hindsight's 2020, those have been the markers to guide the ship to what you just said, which is is it about the people or is it about the work? And what I found is when you build a community of people who have B values and it's about the mission and what we're creating in the world, those people are open to the feedback. Look, we all have a little heartburn when we get hard feedback. That's fine. Just like we all make provision for that, move on. But at the end of the day, they're asking these types of questions. Is the feedback true?
Mm-hmm.
And if it's true, maybe I don't like how it was delivered. Maybe I don't like who delivered it, but I get over that because you know what? This feedback creates more perfection in the world, more beauty, advances what I actually care about, which is not me and me looking good. It's me putting people on Mars, or me creating electric cars, or me creating a large social network, or me making information free in the world, or in our case, us helping hopefully 1 billion plus people live a clear, more purposeful life. And if you're going to candidly, like if you're going to let someone's management style or feedback be the obstacle to that, and there probably are cases where some people's management feedback is so toxic, it just becomes that. But for the most part, and at BetterUp, we don't see that. Then it says a lot more about you than probably the feedback giver. And that's not, by the way, I've worked in all sorts of, I've worked in for-profit, I've worked in nonprofit, I've worked in public sector at this point. I've been really fortunate. I've worked at public companies, I've worked at scale-ups, startups. I haven't seen everything, but I've seen more work context than probably the average bear my age. I think I can say that without boasting. It's probably not a good thing. It's like I shuffled around a lot, but that's not how most people want to work. And I think Silicon Valley, and I don't mean the physical place, but as a, you know,
Mentality.
as a zeitgeist, it's not a place for most people.
Yep.
Like it really isn't. It's a place for people who want to build great things. And whether you're a designer, whether you're a lawyer, like if you're in these high craft professions, you're used to your work getting torn apart. We don't even tear it apart at BetterUp, but like you're used to I mean, think of Pixar. They did this probably most compassionately, but you read about those like brain trust and those writer rooms with John Lasseter and Ed Catmull. And like, I mean, they're not mean, but they're not sparing. I mean, one of the bestest anecdotes of this of all time in management is Walt Disney was being screened a movie by the team, and the director sneaked out because he knew it was bad halfway through and he didn't want Walt to tell him. And then he was leaving the studio, going down whatever Burbank Boulevard or whatever it is, and he runs into a guy in the intersection, and it's Walt Disney who put himself in the intersection in LA, pounding his fist on the car because he's like, you don't get to leave till you get the feedback so you can be better.
Yep.
Right? He almost killed the man. But Walt is just like, I'm not going to skip the opportunity to help you improve your craft. And the guy was like, Walt's right. Like, shame on me for trying to save my face instead of making a better movie. What do I care more about? I should have wanted to make a better movie because Walt's not doing this to hurt me. Walt's doing this to help me before I go show this to a global audience. And then my feelings really get hurt and we lose a lot of money. And so that is a different wiring I find. I think Bezos says this best with like, as humans, we're social creatures wired for affection, approval, validation, not really for truth.
Yep.
I actually think we're more deeply wired for truth. We just don't show up that way most of the time. And I don't know that he would disagree with it. But I think you're finding people whose their default circuit, they're quicker attuners and switchers to truth matters more than how I feel. And it took us, candidly, a lot of mistakes and a lot of mishires and a lot of us developing and evolving as managers to do that. And the other real thing, I know this is a long answer on this one, but you hit a vein. The other thing I'll say is, I think you can be obsessive, but you don't have to be unbalanced. And I think that's a maturity journey. And I'll probably always be an obsessive person. I'm a lot less unbalanced than 10 years ago as a leader and manager. And I think anyone, you read the Steve Jobs biography, I mean, the guy definitely matured and he became less, I don't know if he was ever unbalanced, but like not crying in office.
He got fired from the first version of Apple. So he clearly,
like you mature. So I think you can keep the obsession at some level as like a combustion engine inside of you. But I do think there's some art and there's some growth and there's some opportunity to do that in a way that's less off-putting, because that doesn't actually help. That doesn't help your ends in creating a bunch of like human collateral damage or blast radius around you as you do it. And sure, if the choice is compromise on truth and beauty and doing it right, yes, you should probably just still be uncompromising. You're right, but it's not. That's a false trade-off. I think you can do it a little more gracefully and you can still not compromise on your standards.
Do you think, how do you hire and fire for people in building that cultural element where people are willing to be a part of that, right? So how do you find, because look, when you start getting, the problem is sort of a chicken and egg issue. What I mean by that is basically, if you build a great small core team and you start having a certain element of success, is that success because the idea is just great and it's just taking off? Is it because of the people you brought on? And then of course, as people hear about you and want to join, are they joining because they want to go join this obsessive culture that's building something great and different? Or are they joining because they see success and they see dollar signs and they say, I want to get rich off of the backs of everyone else's work? So one sort of, what do you think is sort of comes first? This great team, the obsessive founder, and then it takes off? Or you get lucky, you have an idea that does fit, right time, right place, and then it takes off. And then how do you hire for the right people to join that team who aren't just saying, I read on your website, BetterUp is doing all these great things, and I'm just so excited. And you're like, but are you really? Do you really want to be a part of this? It is tough. It is hard every day. And I'm going to ask you really tough questions and tell you the truth. And you might not like hearing it. So how do you figure all those elements out?
I mean, the answer to all that is yes. Okay. I mean, I think it's like they all are entangled at some level. Look, I mean, I think to the heart of your question, we can unpack the other stuff too. There's a lot of goodness in there. It's like, yeah, we've literally pivoted over the years to doing that. I mean, early on, you know this, you're trying to convince anyone, and that's why a lot of startups start with your friends. And Eddie was a friend of mine. Like, it's people who believe in you because the idea is so obtuse or ill-baked even, or, like it's really, people are kind of believing in the mission, maybe the market. We didn't even have a market, like the vision, for lack of a better term, and probably the founder. Investors are probably early, as you know better than me, you invest more, are believing in the team in the market usually, because they're like, the idea is probably going to change, but I'm really problem space. And can this team pivot, figure it out? Because in 10 years, they'll probably be doing something different. But it does work against you at some level. And we messed this up at a few key points in BetterUp's history. We had little runs of success. And, the saying we say now is we don't hire mission-driven people anymore. Because who doesn't like our mission? You got to have a heart of coal if you're like, I actually don't want people to live better lives. Yep. I like them to live the same lives. I mean, at worst, you'd be ambivalent to the mission. But when you start to see the economic success and ambivalence to the mission, you can get really excited, to your point. And what we now say is we don't want mission-driven people, because that's like a meme. We want people who are driven by the mission. Are you driven by this mission? Yep. You going to stay up late? You going to work on a weekend? Not because we tell you to. We don't tell our employees to. But our best employees, turns out, I find in practice, work harder than everyone else. Yep. Surprise. And guess what? It's not at odds with their well-being. They like their work. It makes their life more meaningful. And they're actually happier, measurably happier when they do it. And that's not at cross purposes. And is that every human? Would I recommend that to every human? No, I wouldn't recommend a startup to 95% of humans, maybe even more. And I certainly, within the startup ecosystem, wouldn't recommend BetterUp, because it's this unique balance of, we're like a nonprofit mission with a for-profit business model. And, we have the heart of NGO workers and the work ethic and the hustle of startup tech workers. And that's a small Venn diagram. And we kind of dialed it in now, but and I don't know that it's even perfect, but to your point and to where your brain went, in our hiring process now, it basically ends with us convincing you why you shouldn't work here. And because, we've just learned it's better not to hire than make the wrong hire. And when money was plentiful, when capital was cheap, I think we well-intendedly, made some wrong hires, and that's on us. I don't blame the hires. You can't hire yourself. That's on us. And we lived and we learned, and we try to be gracious about it when it happens. And you try to set those people up for success, which isn't hard to do because they're probably not being successful at your company. So setting them up elsewhere, they'll be more successful. So it's actually the right thing for them, the right thing for you. It obviously doesn't feel great in the moment, but that's on us as leaders. We have to take responsibility for that. And the root of that is not having clarity of what defines success at that stage of life in your company. And you're sometimes growing so fast, it's hard to take a beat. And a beat doesn't have to be like a quarter. It's like, I wish in retrospect, I would have taken a month or a few weeks sometimes to really push ourselves as a leadership team. We're really clear on what success in these roles looks like when we're going to hire 200 of them, and it's like, because if we're wrong by 5%, that's a lot of people that we're not going to set up for success here. And what's unique about us? And are we giving voice to that? We we have a very nice mission, but we also have a particular, all good cultures have a peculiar way of working. And we realized we weren't giving enough voice to that like, this is how we work. And these are the non-negotiables here. And like, if those don't work for you, let's find that out early in the hiring process so you can go elsewhere. We're probably not going to change our values. We're probably not going to change these behaviors. Like, but we also, you don't have to come work here. Like, if you don't like that, like, if you don't want to do what Walt Disney wanted to do, they're very clear. Don't come work at the Walt Disney Company.
Yeah.
It's kind of like really simple.
But you probably would also, you miss out on an opportunity to do something great too, right? And that is where, that is what the great cultures.
You can go somewhere else. There's other great things, but here's what I always tell the team. There's only one company in the world who's going to make our mission come true. It's us, because it's the only company in the world with this mission. So it's really simple. Do you want this specific mission to come true? If you do, then we're kind of the only place you can do that in the entire history of humanity. Mm-hmm. If you want a 5% different mission, there's probably some other companies. But if you want Tesla's mission to come true, there's like one company in the world that's going to do that.
Yeah,
specifically Tesla. So your choice is to like join Tesla and make it better, or your choice is to say, I'm okay with a slightly different mission. And both are valid choices. Your choice is not to go to Tesla and not do the mission. Yeah. Like that is not, in my opinion, that is not a high integrity choice.
How much time do you think you spend today? And then if you think back many years as well, when it comes to recruiting, building the team, cultural pieces like that?
A lot. I mean, I spend a lot. I did a 2-hour leadership onboarding yesterday morning. We do monthly for all of our, like, just constantly for all new executives at the company. I still do employee onboarding for all new employees. I mean, I heard this stat once that Steve Jobs, in his kind of twilight years as CEO, was still spending 40% of his time on hiring. And I heard that very early in my journey and thought it was crazy. And it's probably more true than not. Like, it's probably half my time with culture and hiring, but hiring is probably 30 to 40% of my time. Like, it's kind of your most potent, powerful, creative lever as a CEO. You're not going to do the stuff yourself at some stage. I mean, you're a 5-person company, yes, but at some stage, you're not the best person to do it directly. You couldn't, even if you were the best person, you couldn't, because there's too many jobs to do. Your most expressive lever is the executives, the talent you bring in.
Yeah, you get the greatest leverage from having a great team and letting them do their thing and build what they need to build. So going back, sort of related to the team, but also just going back to one of the initial questions, right, around like sort of excellence and success. When you think through the definition of excellence and success, like what is it that you individually are shooting for? Is it to create, like in sort of also think about the people you've read about, the bios you've read, or the people you know, and how do you measure it as well? So in other words, for some people it might be monetary outcomes. For other people, it might be, hey, I just want to see this occur in the world. And of course, if you can make it occur in the world, that probably leads to monetary outcomes. But like, how does one measure it, or how do you measure if you've accomplished your goals for BetterUp? What is your success metric look like?
It's always been very clear for me. It's going to be hard to do. It's the mission. You know, like my probably favorite entrepreneurship quote of all times, going back to Walt Disney, is, we don't make movies to make money. We make money to make better movies. And like, I feel that way. Like, we're for profit. We have investors. We have and will continue to generate handsome returns. Counterintuitively, by not focusing on returns. I mean, it can't be dumb to returns. It is a business, but by focusing on the mission, because we think the mission is so big, and then the money kind of falls into place. And so for me, I know I can speak for Eddie on this one too. It's always been what we called ourselves story metrics about the mission. Like, you know, I don't know if I'll ever feel we've achieved it. We've kind of set this number of 1 billion people. It's arbitrary, you know, it feels like a good starting point. When we cross that, we can kick the goal out further. But, you know, for us, it's really these stories, and some of the stories have already come true. Some haven't, but it's like, I get really excited about parents gifting their children BetterUp, or employers providing dependent care for their children and families on BetterUp. And we're seeing that start to happen. And that was something Eddie and I told ourselves early on. It's like, we'll know we've been successful when we see this kind of like ripple effect. Yep. We didn't know what the employers do. We thought it would be more like people gifting it like a AAA membership. Turns out it's more like life insurance or health insurance, where it's like dependent care, but it's the same effect of like, one payer is saying, this has helped me so much, I want to gift and extend this to my family system. And then you get this compounding synergistic effect. So, we have little mile markers, like we want to be an independently run company. To do that, you probably need to go public at some point to provide liquidity for employees and investors, have the right governance. But it's not, no, going IPO is not really, has ever been a goal to Eddie and I. Creating a company where we can die in the seat and feel really confident when that happens, that the company will still have the right governance beyond us to pursue this mission. That's been really important to us. And that continues on a personal level to motivate me. But I was doing this in nonprofit before and paying to do it. Now I get paid to do it. So this is all gravy and upside from where I'm sitting, which doesn't give me license to take my foot off the gas, just makes me more excited every day.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then also speaking about like obsession, why don't we dive into briefly about like sort of product and go to market? So in like sales, right?
Sure.
So I think those are key areas that a lot of people maybe not overlook, but it's sort of critical. Like, how did you think through building great product that helps you achieve this mission? And similar question, like you also need to, of course, convince customers to buy this product that barely exists, especially early on. But even today, I bet you're still pre-selling things here and there. We're like, hey, we're going to do this, and convincing people. What did that look like for you?
I think building a product, we have a pretty high bar. My background is building products. So I still feel in general, I'm probably our harshest critic. And I like that, because whenever we launch something, then I'm like, no, it's not as bad as I thought. The market's actually really excited for it.
Oh my God, this isn't good enough. It's not good enough. It's not good enough.
Oh,
no
totally.
matter what.
We just GA'd a product at every customer conference, and I'm like, I'm very confident in it. We just GA'd it. At the same time, there's always a part of me that's like, is that going to break? Is that going to scale? Is that going to work? Is that enough? Is that enough? And I think you learn to manage that cognitively and use that constructively. But I do think for founders, like being real with yourself, if it's a product you could use, are you using it? There's different types of founders, different ways to build businesses, but I'm a big believer in like build for yourself as much as possible. You're your harshest critic. You know the space the best if you've been geeking out on it. Like, be real with yourself. Do you find yourself gravitating to your product? Do you want to use it? Is it helping you? If it's not, it may not be helping others. Sometimes you can't. You're like, well, I'm building a product for an ERP system. I'm not a company. I can't use it. Ours is a B2B2C. So there is this consumer part I can empathize with. And I'm an employer, so I can ask on the enterprise side, would I use it? How would I use it? And so I find that some entrepreneurs try to trick themselves and shortcut those really honest assessments of being really raw with yourself. And no amount of market testing, in my experience, no amount of A/B testing really compensates for that. Like, I've done the work, I've asked the hard questions, I've made the tweaks and the changes, and I really feel good by what I'm standing by. It's scary work, and it's a lot easier to say, hey, the user research says X, good enough, and I really try, and I'm not perfect. I really try. We still use research, by the way, but I really try to be a higher bar, because those are folks who have thought about your product for about 30 seconds. And you've probably been thinking about your product for like 30 months. And so you should have a more discerning bar.
How deep, when you think through as a product leader, how deep are you actually going? Like, are you the obsessive product leader that's sort of like famously Marissa Mayer back at Google, who was like critiquing the color choices that were being made? Or are you reading every PRD that comes through? Or are you more like, I know what the general use case of this is. I know some of the high level costs, and I'm going to critique it. I'm going to put myself in the shoes of the customer in sort of from first principles, think, is this providing value? Or maybe
it depends on the product.
Yeah.
So I think the approach I've taken, I can be that Marissa Mayer archetype, but in very specific veins. So I don't review the majority of product that goes out anymore. I don't have time to, I don't have bandwidth to, and I'm not sure I would actually add much more value from the people doing it. There are specific things which, as a function of my perspective across the business, my global perspective, we use this metaphor BetterUp. You see the whole elephant. Sometimes by certain positions, you only see a foot or you see a tail. And so part of a job of a leader is to show people the whole elephant. And the CEO, let's hope the CEO sees the whole elephant more than anyone else, or you're in real trouble. But you also need people who zoomed in on the toe, right? And like, this is what's going on. This is the ground truth. So I'm very specific and clear with the team, and I've evolved to this. Like, there are X finite amount of product initiatives that I routinely review. And that's it. Like almost nothing else do I look at. I mean, I'll see it in the wild and I may provide feedback. Of course, I'd be negligent not to. But on those things, absolutely, I'll critique the color if I feel the color needs critiquing. I usually don't make the decision. So it's just like brain trust. Here's what I think about the color. I'll be very clear where it's like, no, we're changing the color. But like, that would be a very high escalation point. I can't think of when it would be, I would even feel that it's that important that it's this color. But yeah, it's like I have like weekly meetings on these 3 to 5 strategic initiatives. Some are products, some are business. I did one yesterday. It's a 6-hour working session on a really important product. And there's a lot of other products I haven't probably touched in years, candidly. But on this product, because where it fits in our strategy, the amount of capital we're putting behind it, I would be a bad CEO, in my opinion, if I wasn't at the forefront. And what is it now? Even checking in on that once a month for 6 hours and doing one of those a week, or how I used to do it 2 to 3 hours a week for all of them. I'm trying different formats. You're still reviewing like a very small amount of the surface area. So the majority of the decisions you're still not part of, you still can't make. But yeah, I'll look at the PRD. Are these the big features that are going to win the market that I'm hearing in my conversations with customers? What are you hearing in yours? Let's synthesize that. Okay, that feels good. Is this a critical thing in a user flow that I think is going to derail the product? I'll give you my opinion on that. We can go test it usually and see if I'm right or if you're wrong, right? But I would say a younger version of me was too deferential and probably didn't give enough voice. I think Brian Chesky probably says this best in like a very low ego but matter of fact way of like, yeah, I'm conducting the symphony. I'm like, I'm gonna call some shots, and like that's my job. And that's investors gave me the money, to be honest, to go do this. And they would be really mad, and I'd be really mad with myself if I just pretended I don't have a unique perspective here. And I don't say that with ego or pride. I think it is a really job holding the two. And that doesn't mean that you don't have a unique perspective too. But like if push comes to shove and someone has to make the decision, probably I think it's weird that people think it's weird that it would be the CEO, is my honest answer. So, well, who else would it be? Isn't that the job? Like it shouldn't always be the CEO, or you probably don't have the right product leaders, but there's going to be some decisions that are so central to the company's strategy. It's like, yeah, wouldn't you want the CEO making that decision? And that doesn't diminish anyone else in the room. And I think we have kind of a bad management literature in the Valley over the past 10 years of pretending these are zero-sum trade-offs. Like if the founder makes it, then that means someone else was disempowered. And it's like, in practice, I don't think it works that way most of the time if done right.
Yeah, in fact, you probably want the CEO to make some of these big decisions. You don't want them handed off. The other people don't want that responsibility. Now they should be held to creating that level that you expect, but they don't want that responsibility. Speaking of like a little bit,
or just disagree with the CEO.
Yeah,
I mean, like just have a debate about it. Like, at the end of the day, there's going to be disagreeing to begin. In my experience, you usually disagreeing committing with your direct reports, not the other way around. If you really respect your, but just like have an honest conversation. I think you're wrong. Okay, great. I think you're wrong. Let's have a debate. Like no one's going to die. We're all going to have our jobs tomorrow. Like that's totally fine. Let's just have the debate and agree to disagree and like be clear on the decision rights. And most of the time you're going to have that line executive, whoever, you're going to want them to make the decision. But yeah, there's going to be some special circumstances where it's big and they'll probably, I find, they probably respect you getting involved in and at some level, to your point, they want it because they want to make the right decision too.
When you think through, so I have a thesis and you're sort of talking around some of this, so it makes sense here, that the best entrepreneurs are ones who are willing and able to hand things off in the right way, essentially delegate and delegate well, but not too much or at the right time. How have you thought through delegation, how you do it, when you do it, who you do it to, and how much trust do you give that person? Because I'm sure at some points you've over-delegated and regretted it, but you also can't do everything. Like I've come across founders who literally have told me I can work 100 hours a week and therefore I don't need help. And I'm like, the reason we're literally talking is because your teammate called me to say you need help. But how do you, and so I was like, that company's clearly going to fail. That founder has no idea how to delegate and you can't do it all.
They're titrating performance. Yeah. I mean, it has to be the case, right? Like it's the essence of leadership. The essence of leadership is scale.
Yep.
Like however you want to dress it up. Leadership is about not you. It's about leading other people, i.e. it's about scale. And if you want to do big things, you have to have scaled orders to do them, it turns out, right? And so like you have to delegate. I think the best stuff on this, which is forgotten. We've been rereading it as a management team, is Andy Grove on delegation versus abdication. And I think a lot of people delegate. I made this mistake. They're really abdicating. They're abdicating responsibility and trying to abdicate sometimes accountability. And, I think the antidote to that is actually managers, leaders being really clear on what decision is to be made, and how that decision is part of a higher order decision you've made in a choice architecture, so that these decisions are not rogue and they're not disconnected, and that person's set up for success to make it. And then I think on the how much do you empower them, that's like very personal, and I think it's up to each direct report. It's like kind of like a skill task maturity curve, for lack of a better term. It's like if they've never done it before, you may want to lean in a little more and they'll probably appreciate it. If they're an old pro at it, you're probably just high level. So, I think at one end of the spectrum, I have my co-founder, and technically he's my direct report. I don't think of him that way. I mean, I can look at in his direction, and Eddie will know what I want done and what I'm saying, and he'll go make it happen, and vice versa. So I am very, it's almost like management through, telepathy. I don't know. It's like, okay, then you have others where maybe it's a new executive, they're trying a new job they've never done before. Yeah, I mean, to be fair and set them up for success, even if when you're going to delegate, you probably need little bite-sized chunks so they can get some small wins and get their feet. And that's not patronizing. That's actually setting them up for success. And you can be really clear about that. Like I've gotten to where I'm just clear with people. Just like, hey, for the first 6 months, I'm gonna lean in here and I'm gonna be around the well and I'm gonna help you. And that doesn't come from a place of distrust. That comes from a place of I trust you or I wouldn't have hired you as an interpersonal dimension. But I also know you're still getting your training wheels and I'm here to help. And I think people, if you just are clear about that expectation, I find the vast majority of direct reports are like, well, thank you. Where it becomes problematic is when they don't think you mean it, or they think it's like subterfuge for I'm looking over your shoulder because I don't trust your decisions. But I think that's just about clear expectations. And, this is what I do with everyone. And I'm betting on you being right here. But I've also learned that I need to inspect and verify. That's part of my job, and when I don't do that, bad things happen to the company.
100%. And how do you think through sales and go to market? So even early days and even today, and I'll say before you kind of answer this, I still remember a point, and you probably will pinpoint this much better than I will, but we were going to catch up on something, and you basically said, I don't have any time. I basically had to let my, I think, sales leader go at the time, and you're like, I'm now traveling nonstop around the world to go get all these sales done and keep things moving. And I was like, wow, like that is a amazing founder who's saying, you know what, I'm going to drop whatever else I was onto. It didn't work out with the person who was here. I'm now going to become the number one. I'm going to become the VP of sales. And that is not your background. And yet you took that on and presumably did a pretty good job at it, because you're here today still speaking in BetterUp is doing great. So what does that look like? Because of course, in the beginning, it's all founder-led sales, and you tell everyone, the team, your investors, your customers. And then how has it changed over time for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think that beginning is so important because you kind of like, now we have LLMs that we can use as a metaphor for our own cognition, but you're kind of training the algorithms. You're training data set on what the market is, where the real pain, unmet needs of the customer are. Sometimes needs they don't even see. You can't exchange those years for anything, and it's good to have a refresher now and then. So those moments suck where you sometimes have to dive in as a founder because someone's not there or they're not able to scale up the business. But in retrospect, I actually think they're like blessings in disguise. And the trick is to just, not do it too long, because you do want to find the right person. So I think to your question, you're always selling, because selling, I think, is learning as a founder. It's you're meeting the market, you're exchanging information, you're having conversation. And when you have more value than the value of their cash, you do business. When you don't have more value than that of their cash, guess what? They don't buy things. And so it's a real test on, do you have more value? And are you creating enough value? And it's really good to be there at the front lines. Like now I'm mainly involved in sales as exec sponsors and deals, or I'll kick off processes when I get an intro, but I try to I'm not in the day-to-day, but I try to stay close enough so I can learn, what are they really buying? What is the problem? Because that informs the product roadmap. That informs the business strategy. And so I never want to lose some amount of tethering there in terms of that is where the business exists. And so then it's hiring go-to-market executives that are energized by that, They love the idea of being on the front lines with you in some ways. They view you as additive to that, not an intrusion to that. And they also don't need you there. Like if you don't have to be there, they can get the job done, they can hit the number, they can build a machine. And that's a delicate balance. And so if you're B2B to C, you know this, like the half-life on the average go-to-market executive, not our data, although our own experience, I think, corroborates this, is under 2 years. It's about 15 to 18 months. And that's if they're doing the job well, because you're like doubling every year. So you're going from like 50 million to hundreds of millions in a few years, like very different skill set. And so you are going to, don't worry about if you're a founder, when you'll have to get re-involved in sales. It will be more times than you ever want. Like you don't even have to worry about it. It's going to just always be pulling you in. Actually, you should worry about like, how do you get less involved in sales? And you're still never going to get there in my experience. And the answer is you're hiring people who have seen that next sales. Like go to market is not something you intuit. There is an army size operation, logistics, ops, all this stuff. If you're a direct sales model, which we predominantly are, and at some level, if you've never seen that at $100 million, you're probably not going to figure it out from first principles. You can figure out a product for a $100 million business from first principles or talking to the market. But like what we've learned is you've got to hire leaders who either built at that stage before as the number one, or were like the number two alongside the builder at that stage.
Yep.
So they know what good looks like, because maybe there's better, more go-to-market oriented founders than us. There probably are. I'm more of a product oriented founder, but like, you just can't figure some of this stuff out. It is not, I don't want to say it's irrational, but it's not obvious. And it's not like you can't do it through deduction. And so it is maybe the most part of a B2B enterprise SaaS leadership team where experience matters. And the tricky part with experience is experience encodes past success. And if you're doing something novel and new, that cuts both ways. And so the hardest part in hiring go-to-market leaders is balancing, I've seen success and I have the playbook, with I can still improvise and play jazz. And I'm not bound by that playbook. And that, jazz musicians have internalized the scale, but the job is jazz music. You just, if I go play the saxophone, I may pretend it's jazz. It's actually just rambling crap. But if a jazz musician can probably also play very classical pieces of music flawlessly, it's actually a higher evolution. And that is the hardest thing, I think, for innovative companies is how do you get people who have seen excellence at scale, but haven't lost the build gene, and they haven't lost the think from first principles gene, and they can temper both of that with the I've seen this before gene. And that Venn diagram is very, very small in my experience.
How do you know then as a founder for this is to the point of like, we want to hire people who've been there before, know how to do it, but also have that still drive and energy. I understand you can probably hire for some of that, but how do you even manage that properly, right? We think we got the right guy, the person's or the right girl or gal, whatever. They're doing great. They got it. They're the perfect hire for us. And then suddenly it's like, wait a second, they're not getting it done. How do you know though? Because you haven't done this before. You haven't been the person who's gone and scaled it at some other company. So how do you know that they're actually achieving those metrics?
Sometimes I've known really fast before. I mean, sometimes it's just poor behavior. So you're like, okay, this is an ethics thing or a culture thing, and it's like, it's not going to work. I've seen this rodeo, but I think, having messed this up quite a lot, actually, fortunately, not so much that we haven't grown great, but more than I probably should have. It's being really clear on what the leading indicators of success are. Revenue is a lagging indicator. It's too late. And depending on what your sales cycle is, it's way too late. So if you have a 6 to 9 month sales cycle and you're waiting to see how much revenue they generate, you're going to be waiting approximately a minimum of 6 to 9 months, plus that leader's ramp time. So you're a year plus until you really are going to see their effectiveness. If you're just looking at AAR or something, or NAR they put on. But if you say, hey, I know in our sales, and this is why it's important when you are in sales mode as a founder to get really smart on it, right? Like, and you have the clarity on the job. Okay, I know really the most important thing in our pipe, where the most important pivotal stage is blah. Like for us, we're category creators, we're budget creators. Prospecting is really important. Being an evangelical salesperson is really important. We know the markers of that now in our pipeline. So if I bring in a new sales leader, and I brought in 6 new go-to-market leaders in the last like 12 to 18 months, right? I can look and say, okay, well, I don't need to wait for revenue. What are the leading indicators? Like, am I seeing stage 2 pipe? What's the quality of that pipe? What are the deals? Go talk to the customers. How do they feel working with that person? Go talk to the team. And, I now, knock on wood, like typically within 6 months, I feel I know enough to make a decision on the person. Now, only time will tell if those decisions are right. But there was a time where I was not confident at 6 months. I was not confident until I saw AAR. And so in retrospect, it was because I actually wasn't clear enough on the revenue model. And when you're building, you can't be clear, by the way. No Series A CEO can be that clear in the revenue model in a B2B business. But as you grow, you get that clarity as a business. You have more data depth. You can run probability, weight adjusted. You can also run statistical models and things. And so now I'm looking at those leading indicators, both behavioral, cultural leading indicators, but also performance leading indicators versus lagging indicators. And then I just ask myself, do I think they'll get there? And based on the data information I see, is this person, if I give them another 6 months, or would I rather start again with someone else? And, most of the time I think they'll get there, but a fair amount can go to market. Maybe a third of the time I'm wrong. It's like, okay, this isn't the right hire.
It's a tough decision because you obviously put a ton of time and effort into hiring them
Totally.
in the first place. And you're like, I think they're great. That's why you hired them in the first place. And now suddenly it's like,
Totally
not working. We got to go back to square one and start over. And we're 6 to 12 months behind our goal plan here with this role is so tough. How do you
Well, what's worse than that, and I've done this way too. What's worse than that is feeling that, not making the decision, and then waiting for the revenue, which may or may not come, and then having to make that decision. So that's actually the worst one. As bad as the first one feels in the moment, it feels a lot worse to wait for the lagging indicator.
And so it implies, of course, be smarter about your hiring decisions as fast as you can, and like be good at hiring as soon as possible. Related to all of that too, and I want to be cognizant of time, but related to all that, how do you deal with topping people job-wise, right? So you had a VP of sales when you're a seed company or a Series A or something.
Yeah.
But now you go to Series B and you have a new VP of sales you need to bring on board, you have a different skill set, but you love your current VP of sales. How do you deal with that? And by the way, it probably goes same thing in product and every other, for success, all these other places. How do you have those tough decisions and not lose the person who's great, maybe still, but they're just not ready for Series B, Series C, VP level?
Yeah, this is, from what I can tell, is an area where we've had marginally more success or a higher keep rate. If we define that as success, I think it's success in layering folks or topping them than when I talk to other founders. I actually think purpose and mission is the most transcendent lever there. If you're starting with people who really believe in the mission and they feel that this mission uniquely intersects with their calling or their life's work, their bias is going to be to find a way to stay because, it's really important existentially to them. And that can be good or bad, by the way. Sometimes you'd actually rather they don't stay. It's not a great fit. For the most part, we'd rather folks stay. They care deeply. They have a ton of institutional knowledge, and short of bad behavior, we're really motivated to find them the right role. And so we just try to be really candid and open and honest about that. I think some techniques I'll get into that I think help bring clarity to that is one, it's first just telling people that, like, hey, I don't think that you're scaling with where the business is going in this role. Let's say it's a CXO role. I don't think you're scaling where the business is going in this CXO role. And it's often a really honest conversation about, I actually think you could be a great CX whatever somewhere else. And, at the same time, we need to hire new and we'd love to keep you. Sometimes you don't want to keep them, to be honest. You don't have to say we don't love to keep you. Just say, let's set you up somewhere else.
Yeah.
But in the case we're talking about where you do, I think you can be really honest and be like, look, to be fair to you, Adam, you could be a great CXO at another company our stage, and that's a personal decision. And it would make me really sad if you decide to go do that. But I totally understand if you decide to go do that. And I respect the heck out of it for you. And if you want to go do that, by the way, like, I'm going to help you go do that. Like, our board's going to help you go do that. Let's go help you go do that. But I do want to talk about, because we believe in you, we know you believe in the mission, you poured your blood, sweat, and tears here, you have a ton of equity, probably if they're CXO, and I think there's some real developmental opportunities here that if you would take an SVP role, and help us hire the next CXO, that could be awesome for your career. And by the way, I want you to be energized about the person we hire and authentically want to learn from them. And if you get there and you're like, I don't think I'm going to learn from this person, that's probably good feedback for me that maybe I'm not hiring at the next tier. But also, okay, then let's have the conversation there. And I find 2/3 of the time, in our experience, people can ego manage it and it aligns with what they want. Yeah. There's 1/3 of the time where I respect it, but they just can't sometimes it's ego, sometimes it's just not ego, it's just career pathing. But I find the majority of the time, if framed right, and you're starting with people who are in it to win it, for lack of a better term, they're inclined to do that.
Yeah.
When framed poorly, and I have framed it poorly, I've learned from a lot of mistakes here. Yeah, they're like, you suck. Like, I gave my all to this thing and it feels like you're rolling me out of here. So that's more a reflection on you as the manager, or me in that case, of probably not doing it in the best way possible.
I find sometimes people are not patient enough either with things. They're sort of like, sometimes like, hey, like, see how this works out. Maybe this person's going to be great, could work great for you. Or or maybe they don't work out, but you level yourself up over the next 6 to 12 months as Alexi makes a decision. You might be right for the role in a different point when you learn a little bit more. But with all that said, in given time, I have one question I always ask every single person at the end of the podcast, which is, if there's one single piece of advice you could give to any entrepreneur to achieve excellence, what would you boil it all down to?
Well, I think it's authentic to say this. I'd get a coach.
Yep.
And the reason I'd say this is, in my lived experience, and I was benefiting from coaching and doing coaching before I started BetterUp. So what coaching more often in my experience has done is it's given me more courage and more clarity to give voice to what my intuition was saying in the first place. And so I almost said that, which is like, go with your gut more. But in practice, the reason and the ability for me to go with my gut more, and probably to go in a proper way, like our guts say dumb things all the time. Mine does. I have a lot of bad ideas from my gut. But going and talking with a coach through that helps me sort through that, and actually like appeases the rational part of my brain that is like, this is not a gut feeling. It is a gut feeling, but here's actually unpacking why it's also a good idea. And I do think, zooming out, this is like that is one of the most important things as an entrepreneur. Some of this point of view we're talking about, some of this worldview you have, some of this stuff, it expresses itself in like spidey senses that are hard to give words to sometimes. And the problem with things that may be the right decisions that are hard to give words to is it's really hard to enlist people to follow you. And so I think coaching is a powerful way through this lens to give yourself words to what your intuition may be right, your judgment may be right and sound, but if you don't have the right way to say it to people, you're not going to inspire people to follow you, because it just sounds like you're saying something emotional. And actually you are saying something emotional because your emotion
You believe it,
is
you
tapped
feel
in
it.
really deeply.
Literally.
Yeah, you actually are right rationally, but you don't even rationally have the utterance to say it. So your emotion steps up and says like, KPI dashboard, red, or green. And coaching, for me at least, is a way to unpack that and be like, oh, here's why I feel green. It's because blah, blah, blah. And it's that rationale that you can then go take and build a compelling case and a pitch and enlist other people around. But the crux of it is, go with your gut. And coaching for me is a great way to have more confidence to do that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And by the way, we get a large majority of our team actually BetterUp coaches. So for all those listening,
awesome.
I think it's a huge value add. Alexi, this time flew by.
Crazy.
I am literally, I'm like, I want to invest again in you, because I'm just like, this is sort of investor that I want to invest in.
No, don't do it now. Your cost of capital will move.
Oh no, I agree. Like we're in a good place. But seriously, like I see why you've been able to build this team in the company you've been able to build, is because you're still obsessed by this idea. You're energized by it every single day. You have thoughtful answers to what you're doing, and that is what leads to great companies and success, and somebody who can change the world. So thank you for letting me be a part of this journey and learn from you. I sincerely appreciate it. And of course, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for all the belief, and thanks for literally believing us when I think we can say in your case, like 2 other people did.
Yep.
So like, they were like, I don't say no one, because there was like 3 of you. So thank you for being literally one of the first checks in, and thanks for all the support and co-building along the way, man. We're excited to keep going.
I thank you again. Sincerely appreciate it.